On RN, this is Counterpoint. Hi, I'm Amanda Vanstone. And it's good to be back with you after my holidays. On today's program, we'll be talking about ageing demographics and what it means for the economy. Is it really all bad news, or can we find at least some positives in the idea that we're all getting a little bit, if not quite a lot, older? Can we learn anything from the Japanese experience? Well, to talk about this phenomenon in the Western world, Leith Van Onselen will join us a bit later from our Melbourne studios. And for Japan in particular, Nicholas Eberstadt will talk to us from his home in Washington. Many years ago when I was a teenager, there was a folk group called Peter, Paul and Mary, and one of their famous songs was called Blowing in the Wind. I had not the slightest idea that economies of the world might be affected by headwinds and tailwinds, and Leith Van Onselen is here to tell us exactly that. Leith, welcome to the program.
Hi Amanda, how are you?
You've been writing articles about ageing populations. It's all a bit depressing, isn't it?
Not really, it's just an inevitable part of life. I mean, people are born, they grow up, they move into work, they grow old, and then unfortunately we depart. It's just an inevitable part of life.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. Now, you've produced some fairly simple graphs, and I say that as a compliment because it means people can easily understand what you're saying, to show that dependency ratios have been really good in a lot of Western countries. That is, we've had a lot more people generating wealth than being dependent on it. But we might have hit the bottom, and now we're going the other way, where we're going to have more people dependent on us than ever before. How are we going to cope with that?
First of all, you're spot on. Basically in the 40 years to 2010, as the large baby boomer generation moved from childhood and adolescence into full-time work, Australia and most other developed countries around the world effectively moved into what I like to call a demographic sweet spot. And that's
a
when
bit sexy for an economist, isn't it, to be talking about sweet spots?
Yeah, it is. But as I said, in the 40 years to 2010, Australia and these other advanced economies moved into the demographic sweet spot. And what that effectively is we had obviously the large baby boomer cohort of the population, which was pretty much universal around the developed world, that moved from childhood and adolescence into the working population. And what that did was it dramatically reduced the number of dependents, so those under the age of 20 or over the age of 65, and substantially increased the number of workers across these economies. And what it did was it created a structure that was optimal to growth, because we had obviously a much higher proportion of workers and a lower proportion of non-workers to support.
But we've hit that sweet spot and passed it, haven't we?
That's right. The first of the baby boomer generation, so the oldest ones, effectively hit age 65 from 2011. And that's the official retirement age. And effectively for the next 2 to 3 decades going forward, as the baby boomers move into retirement, the sweet spot is actually becoming a curse, in that the dependency ratio, so the number of dependents, or really the aged, that have to be supported by the working age population, is growing as the working age population shrinks and those baby boomers move into old age. And what that does is it creates a population profile that's suboptimal to growth, which means that growth rates are likely to be a lot lower going forward than what we've experienced, and also lower income growth.
Now, up until we were in that sweet spot where we had lots and lots of people who were working, more so than those who weren't, that had an impact on our economy, and I think you describe it as giving us a bit of a tailwind.
That's right. Whenever you have an economy which has got a very high number of workers to non-workers, you're effectively going to increase the growth rate in that economy, because purely because you're producing more, etc. It also increases the consumption across the economy, because you have more people who are actually earning income and have higher disposable incomes to spend. And because of those two byproducts, more people in work, you also have higher income growth across the economy. But now that Australia and these other economies have shifted away from the sweet spot and into the demographic curse, as more baby boomers retire and we have a higher portion of old age people to support, that reverses those tailwinds and makes them into headwinds.
Leith, you're not seriously telling us, are you, that when politicians in the past have stood up and claimed credit for growth rates, that they were being a bit deceitful or kidding themselves?
A little bit. I mean,
quite a lot maybe.
Yeah, possibly. But yes, certainly growth rates have been inflated across the developed nations for the past 40 years. And All this means is that the growth going forwards will likely be, substantially a bit lower. It doesn't mean it'll be negative, but it's just really an expectations thing. People have got the expectation of having living standards increasing at fairly strong rates, and it just means that going forward it's going to be a little bit harder to achieve those sort of living standards. But
because we have got used to it, someone said you better get used to it, and we did. And perhaps now we're going to feel the change even more so, because we've had sort of plus growth, and if we now get a headwind, it's going to feel like a real drag.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that growth is going to turn negative. It just means that it'll be a little bit harder to achieve that growth. And I will add that there is actually a good side of this story. One of the main reasons why we've now hit this demographic headwind is because people are living longer. And that's actually, a good thing. I'd personally rather live to 85, say, in good health than live to 65. And that's something we should actually be pretty happy about. Sure, it means that we have this transition phase where we have more people to support, but by and large, I think everyone would prefer to have a longer, healthier life than a shorter, less healthy life.
Well, slower growth might not produce the sort of wealth that we want, but it's not in itself a bad thing. It was still growing. But will that create pressure for politicians or governments, let's put it that way, or parliamentarians, choose whichever title you want? Because of our expectations of higher growth, will we as a community demand that they continue and therefore pressure our politicians into what I would call, stupid extra spending to try and generate more growth in the economy?
Absolutely. Politicians by nature are fairly reactive. They have to be. And they, for their own livelihoods and their own longevity, react to what the people demand. And if people are putting immense pressure on the politicians to maintain the standard of living, whether that means going into huge amounts of debt to fund government services, etc., well, they're likely to do that. But I guess the point is it's going to be a lot harder on governments and politicians going forward because they do have a shrinking employment base to gain taxes from, at the same time as they'll have an ever-increasing amount of old people to look after in retirement. So this does create, quite substantial issues for governments across the world, not just in Australia.
We're going to be talking to someone later in the program about Japan. That is a particular example of this ageing process, and it's a quite extraordinary change in their demography that they face.
That's right. Japan actually has hit this demographic headwind a lot earlier than Australia. Their dependency ratio bottomed out in about 1990, and so they're about 20 years ahead of most of the developed world. And not surprisingly, their economy effectively hit peak growth in the late 80s and early 90s, and ever since that has been in effective decline, not just through rising age dependency, but also because they had a massive property bubble and a share market bubble that also burst.
What can we do, do you think, to make our community or help our community understand that this ageing population means we will have slower growth and that we might need to reduce our expectations of government?
Well, I think it gets down to commentators, but also politicians and policymakers to actually communicate that this is happening and sort of explain it, frame it that it's not necessarily a bad thing because people are living longer and that's good, but that these challenges do exist and that it's just something that's going to have to be worn.
At the age of 60, I'm pleased to hear you say that you're happy that we all live a bit longer.
Well, as I said, given the choice, I'd rather live to 85 in a relatively healthy way than live to 65. So it is actually something to celebrate, but it just obviously does create some transitions and some issues, in the short term.
Indeed. Leith, it's been very interesting. Thanks very much. And I hope we've made a contribution today to some of our listeners at least, understanding that growth is going to slow down and the baby boomers are getting older and they're not having as many children. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Amanda.
That was Leith Van Onselen, the Chief Economist at Macro Business, who also writes under the name of the Unconventional Economist. I'm Amanda Vanstone. This is Counterpoint. And as you just heard, Japan hit this demographic headwind a long time before we did. So how has it coped, both as a society and as an economic powerhouse? Nicholas Eberstadt will join us in a few minutes to discuss the shrinking of Japan. And while we get him on the phone, how could I resist playing you a bit of this?
How many roads must a man walk down before they call him a man? How must a white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? How many times must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. How many years must a mountain exist before it is washed to the sea? How many years can some people exist before they're allowed to be free? How many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. How many times must a man look up before he can see the sky? How many ears must one man have before he can hear people cry? How many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
Well, when I was much younger, Japan was seen as a powerhouse, moving from a country that produced things that people didn't want to a country that could produce products that were fantastic. Who didn't want and doesn't now want a fabulous Nikon camera? But things are changing in Japan. All those young people that were smart and savvy and got on with building the country, well, they're getting older. And here to talk to us about that is Nicholas Eberstadt. Nicholas, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Now, what's the turning point that Japan has faced?
Well, of course, Japan has been struggling for almost a generation since the popping of its bubble economy back at the late 1980s. More recently, there's been a big demographic turning point, which is just a few years ago. The exact time is not quite clear, but just a few years ago, Japan became a net mortality society. It became a country where more people are dying than are being born. And since Japan has almost no immigration, this means that Japan has entered into long-term population decline. It's a long-term population decline for the world's healthiest society. Japanese people have the longest life expectancy, we believe, of any population on Earth, and health continues to improve. But Japan is becoming grayer and smaller with each passing month.
Now, Germany's faced this problem. Is it a long-term problem for them as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, let's be clear about it. It's certainly possible for a shrinking society, as the Germans have a lot of discussion about schrumpfende Gesellschaft, a shrinking society. It's certainly possible for a shrinking society to become more prosperous, for living standards to increase, but there are new and relatively unfamiliar problems that confront healthy, graying, shrinking societies. And Japan has a lot of these.
Well, I was surprised to read in your article that by 2040, which is, not that far away, there could be 1 centenarian for every new Japanese newborn.
Well, that's, of course, the function of two different trends. One is the fantastic blessing of improved health for older people in Japan, which means there'll be a lot more people surviving at older ages. But it's also the extraordinary drop-off in childbearing in Japan. More Japanese babies were born in the late 40s than at any time before in history or any time since. And the drop-off since the late 40s has been really astonishing. We think that, say, in the year 1948, which was a real bumper crop, so to speak, for babies in Japan, we think that there were probably 2.5 million or more babies born that year. According to official statistics, Japan is now down to barely 1 million babies a year. So that's a 60% drop since the late 40s. And on official government projections, and these are hardly perfect, but they suggest what Japanese demographers are thinking about, on official projections, Japan's on track to have 700,000, maybe less than 700,000 babies in the year 2040. Now, to put that into perspective, it's not just practically a quarter of the number of babies born in the late 1940s during living memory. It's fewer babies than were born in 1900. It's fewer babies than were born in the 1890s or maybe even the 1880s. It's basically back to the Meiji Restoration era
In the
level of
1800s.
total birth. Yeah, for all of Japan. And since Japan, not to put too fine a point on it, hasn't been a tremendously welcoming society for foreigners and newcomers and immigrants, unless that changes, that kind of puts a big constraint on the total future size of the workforce and everything else.
It's difficult for me and maybe some of our listeners to imagine a country where more than a third of the people will be 65 or older, more than a third, with a median age of almost 45. I mean, that's tremendous change from what we perhaps imagined Japan to be.
We're almost at that right now for Japan. I mean, Japan is the greatest large society, open, large country that humanity has ever seen. And almost half of the people in Japan today are over the age of 45. About half are under. On current trends, just 20 years from now, the median age, the cutoff point between the lower and the upper equal portions of the population, will be in its 50s. I mean, by 2040, Japan is on track to have the same sort of median age as a lot of the sort of places in the U.S. that are thought of as kind of retirement communities, like Sun City, Florida, and places like that. We've never seen anything like that before, and I don't think we know exactly how it's going to operate socially or politically.
No, well, I mean, imagining that a country with about 127 million today, apparently the 10th largest in the world, dropping down to 106 by 2040. 2040 is not that far away.
No.
For a population to drop by 21 million.
Remember, the working age population of Japan has already been shrinking in size for 2 decades. So the last thing that peaks is really the total population size. The working age population size drops before that because a larger and larger number of old people survive and so forth. One of the things which I think the Japanese policymakers haven't even really begun to think about isn't the aggregate totals of people or the composition of age groups by age and sex or gender, but they haven't thought about how social relations are going to change with this transformation. There's something which a few Japanese researchers have pointed to now that I think is going to make this population change much, much, much more difficult than it would otherwise be. And that is the disintegration or evolution of what was once the traditional family in Japan. Because I think many of your listeners will, hear the phrase Asian family values and think, oh, right, okay. So they may not be having very many kids, but they've got these strong families and all of these familial obligations, and this is going to hold society together with like some sort of strong glue. That's all past already. Japan has experienced the same earthquake of divorce and the same earthquake of postponing marriage or flight from marriage that Australia has and Europe has and my country, USA, has. And in some ways, it's more radical. In Japan, it's still true that out-of-marriage births are hugely stigmatized, so that isn't part of the story. But on current trajectories, according to Japanese official researchers, a woman who was born in 1990, who'd be 23 years old today, has about an even chance, only about a 50% chance, of getting married and staying married to age 50. And she has about a even chance, about a 50% chance, of having no grandchildren. Now, think of what that would mean in the context of the population trends we were just discussing. It means that all sorts of things that we have traditionally taken as granted in terms of family support and social networks aren't going to be there for an awful lot of the aging future men and women in this Japan of 2040 we were talking about. That makes everything hugely harder.
Well, one of the things that was interesting in your article was the references you made to the human flavour of this new demographic. And there's a few points that you mentioned that I thought were particularly interesting.
Yes. Well, I mean, there are aspects of this change which are very difficult for me as a non-Japanese to wrap my head around. I mean, just as you say, some of the flavor of this. I mean, there's now much discussed trend, for example, of young men and women who just kind of live in rooms in their parents' homes and just shut themselves off from the outside world. They're kind of like shut-ins, except they're young shut-ins, maybe addicted to internet and computer, but otherwise not participating in the outside world that we conventionally discuss. There's the phenomenon, which is not utterly unique to Japan, but started in Japan, I believe, of renting actors who serve as family members at particular ceremonies or gatherings. There's the rental of pets. I think Japan was the first country in the world in which what was called a marriage ceremony was carried out between a human being and a computer image avatar. I mean, all of this takes us into it seems to me, almost a sort of a science fiction world, or at least maybe, this science fiction and science fantasy describes this sort of vista or horizon better than our social sciences, which may be absolutely pedestrian within a generation.
Yeah. Well, I remember there's a sort of toy you could buy predominantly for little girls that would need to be fed at a particular time and, maybe change its nappy, whatever. It was an exercise in learning how to look after a child.
Yes.
It's been used, for example, to help young teenagers understand what it will be like to be a single mother. So they take one of these and everything's recorded as to how much care they've given, and they realise how much time it takes to have a child. But what you're saying is there are these things called babyloids that are small, furry, robotic dolls, and these aren't to teach young people about the effort involved in looking after a baby. They're there to help older people cope with loneliness and depression.
Exactly so. And
that sounds terrible, that old people have to buy a toy in order to feel as if they're caring for something.
Well, it almost makes me feel as if I'm on the cusp, as in a previous huge generational historical changes. There was a cusp between the oral tradition and the literate tradition, where people before had huge memories and didn't read or write, and then after that people read and wrote, and they didn't necessarily remember things so well. This seems as if it's possibly another sort of enormous social turning point for at least part of humanity, where one goes from the sort of the pre-babyloid or the pre-almost artificial intelligence sort of surrogate relationship unit to the post one. And it seems awfully unimaginable to me, but for all I know, 30 years from now, people will say, oh, it's just like an iPhone. I mean, how can I do without it?
Yes, well, it's unimaginable to me as well.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what else is a surprise. Apparently there's a survey done in Japan, a government survey, that shows that 1/3 of boys between the ages of 16 and 19, 1/3, describe themselves as being uninterested in or positively averse to sexual intimacy.
That's
Now,
right.
that is a surprise because
Well, I mean, that seems to fly in the face of all human
everything we know.
experience to date, doesn't it? It does. Now, of course,
What is going on?
Well, you have to bear in mind that since, let's say, roughly Adam and Eve, everybody has always lied about sex, except that usually people lie about sex by saying they're having more of it or maybe more interested in it than they truly are. I mean, this is, to me, really shocking because it kind of, as you say, it seems so unlike young men, more or less, everywhere, always. But there does seem to be this trend, let's call it, I don't know how far or how long this trend will continue, where both young men and young women say that they are not interested in sex, not interested in sexual intimacy. I mean, how they triumphed over their hormones, I have no idea. But this is very striking trend now that one sees. Now, I don't feel very safe in predicting how far this would go. I mean, it may all have stopped a couple of months before we had this conversation. But if this continues, of course, that leads increasingly in the direction I was describing about the atomization, the flight from marriage, the flight from intimate relationships, the flight maybe to computers and to virtual reality relationships. It sounds very new to me. Maybe if I knew more about history, I'd be able to say, oh, well, there's this analogy or that analogy. But it just sounds awfully new.
It certainly does. You talked about the pathological extreme of people opting out, which is apparently referred to as hikikomori, young people just shutting themselves away. I find that incredible and like to know what you've got to say about that.
It's a very widely discussed phenomenon in Japan, where mainly young men, some young women, but mainly young men, are essentially shut in, usually in their parents' apartments or flats, living in their own room, not interacting with the outside world, essentially abandoning interaction with the outside world. And it may only be a few hundreds of thousands of young people like this, but it's a terribly sad situation for any of the people involved, and it's a significant enough mass tendency that it's attracted a lot of attention. It seems to be a kind of a characteristic of our time. And there's been an awful lot of discussion since the bubble popped during what some people call the lost decades of modern Japan's economic performance, about the shift of young men and young women, but especially of young men, away from the previous sort of ambitious, striving approach towards being what are called herbivores. In Japan, self-described as herbivores. They're harmless, they're not carnivores, they're not looking to be world changers, they're not looking for full-time work even, they're not looking for girlfriends, more shell-shocked and more cautious about the world. And these shut-ins are kind of like the extreme instantiation of this big change that's seen in Japan. And needless to say, it's going to be very hard to support this rising, aging group in Japan on the basis of herbivores and shut-ins.